questions. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for the tailor-made accountability. And now we give the floor to our two co-rapporteurs, Burkhard Balz first.
Herzlichen Dank.
Yes, thank you very much. Chairman. President, thank you very much for your introductory words. I would like to thank you for welcoming me and Pervenche Perez the Thursday before last at the ESRB General Board meeting. For us, it was a very helpful moment, and we really do appreciate your presence here in the committee as chair of the ESRB. Well, this is now your 8th year at the head of the ESRB with your double role. Now, you automatically have the chairmanship of the ESRB, but in your work with the ECB, I'm sure that you have plenty of demands upon your efforts. I think that you've done a good job at wearing these two hats, but the ESRB has always got the strong monetary policy role of the ESRB in the background. The ESRB regulation could lead to more attention being paid to the views of the ESRB. We've got the SSM, and it seems that bodies within the European Central Bank need to also work on accountability. This would strengthen the institution and could actually provide more media impact. The ESRB will certainly have been thinking about how they could be effective and future-orientated in the formation of the regulation. So can we give the ESRB more visibility than we've had to date? How can we have the work of the ESRB better known, not only to the European Parliament, but also to the financial markets and to our citizens ultimately? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Pervenche Perez, we have the group.
Thank you. Well, I'm not going to comment further on the visit that we had last week, but as a co-rapporteur, I do think that this was a very important visit. And as a co-rapporteur, I'd also like to thank you for giving us that opportunity. And I have the impression that it will not be a one-off. But I just wanted to ask you about two things. First of all, in your preliminary comments, you didn't use the B word at all, Brexit. You didn't mention Brexit. From a systemic point of view, I think that the conditions under which the negotiations are taking place with the United Kingdom, even if initially it's perhaps not a monetary issue, it could perhaps lead to movements on the markets, which could have a systemic impact. So could you comment to us a little bit as to how you see things? And then secondly, one of the things that you mentioned quite a lot, you talked about the liquidity risk for investment companies. As you know, we are currently negotiating legislation which was prepared by the Commission on the supervision and regulation of these investment firms. Now, one of the issues is looking at the extent to which the Basel regulations apply, and how this tallies with CRRD. Could you tell us what you think are the main elements that should be included in the legislation, given what you've just told us about the risks of liquidity and the negative impression that people have of the risks related to this sector? Thank you.
Well, on the first question I received, if the issue is make sure that the SRB has more visibility, we don't need any change in governance for that. We need to sit down and see exactly what sort of initiatives the European Parliament would like to see, and then these initiatives will be swiftly implemented. So if, for example, more exposure to financial markets is concerned, we have many channels that we can use, and that's, by the way, and that's where the synergies with the other members of the General Board of the ESRB could be utilized. So if the issue is visibility, we really ought to choose the simplest route, which is basically list a series of initiatives of addressing, for example, financial markets, or addressing subsets of the European Parliament, or addressing other fora, and that is, in principle, is done and is easily done. So I will not comment on other proposed change in the governance at this stage. But if you have questions on that, I'm certainly ready to comment on that too. Now, on Brexit, I should say that it depends very much on how this is being managed. You've seen in the last General Board, we had a first discussion on Brexit. We've been very cautious at approaching Brexit because we have other tables where these things are being discussed, and we certainly don't want to interfere with the negotiating positions. Now, the discussion that has taken place at that meeting was, for me, very instructive because it showed that we can discuss Brexit without interfering with other players. So we can identify risks, and as a matter of fact, now on a separate table, we've also, as you know, created a technical working group with the Bank of England to identify risks and assess risks of Brexit under the hard Brexit scenario. So that is also what we are going to do, and certainly discussions on the Brexit issue will become more frequent in the SRB in the coming months. Now, going to the substance of it, clearly, it depends, as I said, very much how it's being managed. If we look at the real economy impact of Brexit, it's going to be limited I should be cautious here, should be limited in the aggregate. There are certainly some parts of the European Union which are going to be more affected by this event. But in the aggregate and in the short term, it is going to be limited. It's difficult to foresee now what will be the financial consequences of a not well managed process. And I think it's really, we are not negotiating party there. So it's in a sense the duty of all parties here to make sure that certainly the integrity of the single market ought to be protected, that the first declaration of the leaders where the freedoms go all together ought to be respected. At the same time, make sure that the negotiation doesn't generate financial stability risks that in the end would damage all parties. But I will certainly report on Brexit any time the Parliament feels the need on that from our viewpoint, which is not a negotiating party point. Now, on the, you asked me about recommendations on liquidity and leverage for investment funds. We think that, we certainly believe that a diverse set of liquidity management tools in all member states would increase the capacity of fund managers to deal with redemption pressures when market liquidity becomes stressed. Moreover, funds should be able to demonstrate that excessive liquidity mismatches are mitigated or prevented, and that they are able to maintain their investment strategy under stressed market conditions. So liquidity stress testing has a role to play in this area. In terms of leverage, guidance on a framework to assess leverage risks should be developed. And this includes the design, the calibration and implementation of potential leverage limits in alternative investment funds. Thank you.
Thank you. Notis Marias.
Chairman, I would like to mention the function of the various. So, Chairman, I would like to talk about the insurance funds and the way they function. As you all know, they are very important for systemic stability and the functioning of the economy. My question, related to the insurance funds in Greece. The insurance funds, they were really destroyed with the PSI. The damage was at least at the level of 12 billion euros. My question, first of all, 24 billion euros have remained from the package of 86 billion of the loan. Could 14 billion euros be used in order to recapitalize the insurance funds in the same way that the banks were recapitalized? In this way, we will have a really healthy functioning of the insurance funds. And the pensions will not be reduced from the 1st of January 2019, something that is mentioned in the decision of the Eurogroup. And a last question. The government claims that after the program, in the framework of increased surveillance, the government will be able to decide not to implement the reduction of the pensions from the 1st of January 2019. Is this the case? Is this the way you see the decision of the Eurogroup? The government, although in prior actions there is an obligation to reduce the pensions from the 1st of January 2019, that the government will be able not to make this cut in pensions? Thank you.
Members should stick to the point of this hearing, which is ESRB. I mean, we had
the ESRB concerns also the pensions,
yes.
And Mr. Chairman referred to that.
Cato.
Thank you very much, Chair. So in February 2016, the ESRB suggested that regulators could run dedicated carbon stress tests for banks, pension funds and insurers, but there doesn't seem to have been very much public discussion about this since. The Commission has responded to questions from the Parliament by acknowledging, and I'm quoting here, carbon stress testing could be a useful element to evaluate the stability of financial institutions and of the financial system. Similarly, my report on sustainable finance passed by the Parliament recently secured cross-party support calling for, and quoting again, the introduction of European carbon stress tests as proposed by the European Systemic Risk Board in 2016 for banks and other financial intermediaries to be able to determine the risks related to such stranded assets. So given that there's now renewed enthusiasm for the sustainable finance agenda and the development of the taxonomy, what progress has the ESRB made in its plan to develop a method for the ESAs to undertake carbon stress tests of European banks?
With respect to the first two questions, frankly, it's, as I said before, it's not our decision. So, and again, as we discussed before, what really makes difficult the use of public money for recapitalizing private financial intermediaries are state aid legislation, is state aid legislation in the European Union. But as I said, it's not our decision, and we can't really say much about that. The same thing would apply to the other question you had about pension cuts and what the program or the government. We are not in that dialogue anyway, and it's part of the program and the agreement between the government and the member states and the Commission. And now on the second point, on the second question on sustainable finance, the ESRB launched a project team to work further on this topic and to develop methodologies for scenario analysis, which will enhance our analytical capabilities to assess risks from climate change. I'm also glad to announce that the ECB joined the Central Bank and Supervisors Network for greening the system. So that's the work we've done on that point now, and we have to see what the output is. Hopefully, by the next hearing, I will be able to say more on that.
So are you saying that there will be a proposal coming forward next year? What's the time frame for this? Because obviously it's one of the key issues, I would say, eliminating
I understand
climate assets.
this. We have to see what this project team will produce, and then I will be in a better position also as far as the time is concerned. So I'm saying, I'm being told we just started with this. So they just had one meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Bernard Monod.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Président.
Good afternoon, President. On systemic risks, I'd like to talk about the trade war waged by the US against European companies, unilateral financial sanctions that have no legal justification. The French bank BNP Paribas in May 2014 faced a fine of $9 billion slapped on it by the US, following on from extraterritorial interpretation of law by the US. This could happen again at any point in time and could target a European bank with less of a capital buffer than BNP Paribas. Now, EDIS will never get off the ground. And what can you do about this kind of targeted attack from the US administration? It would lead to widespread panic, mass withdrawal from the Eurozone. In February 2018, we saw the Latvian bank decimated thanks to action taken by the US. Even the Russians are affected by the US diktats. Rusal, for example, an aluminium producer, in April last, faced arbitrary sanctions and went bankrupt. And that all has systemic impact on the financial markets. The US authorities have just decided to call into question sanction or to reintroduce sanctions against Iran. Europeans may be punished for crimes that they did not commit. So the central bank should cover European banks. This unilateral scenario could go on and on. US sanctions are being prepared targeting 5 major European companies. For example, one that is involved with Gazprom in Nord Stream 2, Engie.
You spoke.
Okay, let me finish,
No.
please. Souvenons-nous.
Remember Enron and its bankruptcy, the impact it had in 2002, at a time when you were...
The meeting. Yes, but if you use more than your time,
Yeah. Mes questions pour le président.
It's clear. Let's comment,
questions,
Mr. Draghi.
please. Two
No,
questions.
sorry. Please, Mr. Draghi.
At this stage, we have not discussed this. It's clearly an issue, and I think you pointed out a very relevant issue. To the extent that, and I certainly wish not, but if this were to develop into a situation that generates substantial financial stability risks, then the SRB will have to discuss this. What to do to mitigate these risks or to prevent happening. Thank you.
Thank you. I apologize with Matt Carty. Yes, please. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome again, Mr. Draghi, and thank you for your opening comments. I do want to take this opportunity just to put on the record at the very outset my dissatisfaction with the response to our Ombudsman's findings of maladministration in relation to Mr. Draghi's membership of the G30, and I would use this opportunity to call for an end to be brought to what is a clear conflict of interest by committing to leave the G30 before the Ombudsman has to refer the issue to Parliament. My question in relation to your capacity as ESRB Chair focuses on the possibility of a shock to the Irish property market. International finance has fueled a bubble that is causing price and rent increases that that are pricing thousands of people out of both markets. When I raised the issue of a new Irish property bubble with you last year, you remarked that the solution to such non-systemic inflated markets was to be found in local policy, and in Ireland's case, raising the supply of social housing. Comments I fully agree with. Now we have new warnings that have come from the Commission, the IMF, the OECD in recent months that focus on two themes. The first is that the risk of tens of thousands of existing restructured mortgages will be unsustainable in the event that interest rates rise, and the second is that the risk to economic stability posed by the overheated property market, fuelled by private equity funds that are searching for returns in commercial and residential real estate. A surge in credit in recent months is appearing to add fuel to this fire. So my specific questions are, can you outline your view as to what the potential impact of a change interest rate environment on the Irish mortgage situation would be, and whether you have recommendations that you would propose to deflate the property bubble in an orderly way? And then finally, what does does the ESRB intend to publish any warning or opinion to Ireland in relation to the risks that the current situation poses? Thank you, John.
Thank you. Barbara Kappel.
Yes, thank you very much. Chairman. Well, I did have a follow-up question on the subject of Brexit. Since yesterday's Chequers meeting, we know a little bit more. We know what their scenario is for Brexit, that the financial market would not be part of the single market, and that freedom of movement would only be for the goods market. I was wondering what you would imagine under this scenario, that what kind of consequences would there be for financial services being outside the single market? What would be the effect on the stability of the Eurozone? Secondly, a lot of the wholesale trade in banks goes through London. What kind of consequences would you expect in that market? And after the withdrawal of the UK, would the Bank of England have an observer status within the ECB?
Thank you. For the first question, the Central Bank of Ireland has just increased the countercyclical capital buffer from 0 to 1% last week. So that is one answer to the point. But more generally, this question is being posed also in other contexts where we see that either residential real estate valuations, though locally, are sometimes overstretched in large cities and in some countries. And the same thing holds for commercial real estate sector. Now, with respect to the first one, following the analysis in 2016, the SRB had issued warnings to 8 countries that exhibited household indebtedness and strong housing price growth. For the commercial real estate sector, it's even in a sense it's more stretched even more so, and it's also broader in terms of the phenomenon. So the main source of vulnerability in the commercial real estate markets relates to investors' search for yield. And therefore, prices have gone up, also in terms of historical comparisons, especially in prime markets, and made them vulnerable to repricing and sudden changes in risk premium. So here the role of, although the banks are important, but also the role of non-banks and cross-border financing is increasing. So given the rising importance of non-bank and cross-border financing, it's important to investigate whether new instruments, new macroprudential instruments should be made available and also implemented for non-banks' commercial real estate exposures. Now, this is a point we made on several occasions, that we should start thinking about macroprudential instruments for non-banks because they often are actually carrying out activities which are very much like banks. And in this specific case are the main financial intermediaries. So that's as far as the first question is concerned. The second question is, just let me say something that I keep on saying. It's too early, really, to comment on some possibilities that have been discussed but aren't there yet. It's pretty clear that if the integrity of the single market has to be maintained, depending on what the final arrangement is, some activities will have a passport and some others will not. And that is one of the consequences of this transaction. But as I said, the negotiation, the final negotiation is not there yet, so that we can express a view on something concrete. Now, on the Bank of England as observer, we have not discussed yet this as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Burkhard Balz.
Thank you. Very brief, second very short question. There is much competence of central bankers in the ESRB. Of course, that's a good thing, but of course there's also some risk that is only unilateral knowledge. So my question to you, Mr. President, is if there should be more broader expertise beyond the central bankers and the people from the financial supervisors, maybe in the future in the ESRB board. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul Tang.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome, Mr. Draghi. I think your report of the ESRB at 2016, Too Late, Too Sudden, is rather popular in the European Parliament, I must say. So it earned a reference in the initiative report on sustainable finance. In fact, it's also referred to in an amendment on the CRD, where the Parliament tried to include the systemic risk of stranded assets, so to say, in a prudential framework. However, it doesn't seem very popular with you. Whenever I hear you answer on these questions, it's sort of, you seem to have forgotten it. Whereas we have Mike Carney, who clearly warns for stranded assets. So how do you see the developments? I try one more time. Do you think it's taken this report, which I think is a really good report, shouldn't it be brought further? And how would you like to see it brought further by the ESRB itself or by the European Commission? How do we address the issue of stranded assets?
The first question, now, let me say that the voting members of the ESRB have national central banks, the ECB. By the way, the ECB is only 3 out of 37 members, so we are not really telling the ESRB what to do or what to say. 3 out of 37. And then we have the 3 chairs of the Advisory Scientific Committee and the chair of the Advisory Technical Committee, and then the 3 ESAs, the 3 ESAs. So it's central banks, but not only central banks. No, yes. No, but no, it's okay. But I was just making the point that we have a variety of things. But there is also another consideration to make. At national level, 19 member states have appointed central banks as their national designated authority responsible for macroprudential policy in the banking sector. So, all in all, if you put this together and the fact that it's all in all useful to rely on central banks' independence, because that's the other thing, that central banks are independent from their national governments, more than other authorities. Say, by and large, the setup of the ESRB is quite satisfactory. The other question, I was not aware that we are showing reluctance to move along this front, but I would say that first of all, I'm answering as ESRB only now. The proposal by the Commission is linked to earlier work by the ESRB Advisory Scientific Committee, and we launched, as I was saying before, a project team to look into methodologies for the scenario analysis. So we have this working group there. They will work on different scenarios, methodologies. We will see what they produce. But, I mean, if you have other suggestions on how an institution like the ESRB, which looks at risks, macroprudential tools, has this sort of authorities around the table, can do other things, we are open. We're completely open.
The report itself suggests, for example, that you would need, in the end, not just have a methodology for stress tests, but also, of course, the instruments to contain the risk, like capital requirements or exposure limits. The European Parliament tries to include this now in CRR or CRD. I don't see the Commission or any institute moving in that direction.
Well, you know that the ESRB doesn't have the power to impose. So as a result of the working group of the task force work, we may come out with suggestions on what instruments should or could or may be used to cope with this. But we should go step by step. First of all, we develop a methodology, then we see how things are, then we can suggest the instruments.
Maybe you can also suggest that we sometimes go too slow. That's also part of your role, I think.
I'm sorry?
That you may also do the suggestion that the legislator is sometimes moving too slow. That's also part of your job as the ESRB chair, I hope.
Yeah.
So show some impatience.
Okay. Okay. Take note of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much to President Draghi for this double, very positive exchange of views. So now we can conclude our meeting. Next meeting will take place Wednesday, 9 a.m. Thank you.
Thank you. Grazie.